In my layout, the body's margin value is set to 0 in the normalized CSS reset. So why is there a 21 pixel gap above the header? Shouldn't the header be at the top edge of the page? This is a common layout issue that happens with top and bottom margins. You'll likely come across this issue a lot when building your layouts. In fact, many designers and developers run into this without realizing what it is or why it's happening. So in this video, you'll learn why this happens and how to fix it. So the gap you're seeing above the header is actually the top margin of the H1 element. If I open the Chrome Developer Tools and inspect the H1 element, notice how the top margin extends beyond the header and collides with the top margin edge of the body. So now you may be wondering, well, the heading is inside the header container. Shouldn't we see the margin inside the header instead of outside? This is what's called a collapsing margin, and it's a normal behavior in page layout. What's happening is the H1's top margin is touching the top margin of the body. The space between the H1 and its containers collapsed because there's no border or padding area in the header or a content area above the H1 to separate its top margin from the body. Now, if there's nothing to interrupt the two margins, then the margins collapse to the largest of the two margin values. In this case, it's the H1's default top margin. So there are a few different ways I can get rid of this gap. One way is setting the H1's top margin to 0. In my style.css file, I'll create a new rule that targets the H1 element and sets its top margin value to 0. When I save my style sheet and refresh the browser, we can see that the gap is no longer there because now both the body and H1's margins collapsed to 0. Another method I can use to remove the gap above the header is give the main header any top padding value. Back in my style sheet, I'll scroll down to the main header rule, add a padding property, and set the top and bottom padding values to 1em and the left and right padding values to 0. So now when I refresh the page, notice how the top padding value in the header interrupts the two touching margins. The margins are no longer collapsing, so the gap between the body and header goes away. So now that I have some padding around the content in the header, I'm going to give the H1 element a margin of 0. The H1 element inside the header has the class name. So back in my style sheet, under the navigation comment, I'll create a new rule that targets name, and I'll set its margin value to 0. This removes all the extra space above and below the name heading. You may also experience margins collapsing in other adjacent elements, like paragraphs and divs. For instance, if a div's bottom margin is larger than the top margin of the div below it, the margin area between the divs collapses to the largest of the two margin values. Fortunately, we don't have to worry about horizontal margins collapsing because horizontal margins do not collapse.